Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of this particular video. By name, I am Jafet Okaka Ebusetali. So for today, under conflict of laws, we'll be looking at legitimacy and legitimation. Under conflict of law, we'll be looking at legitimacy and legitimation. So first and foremost, we'll first of all deal with legitimacy. Now, what is the meaning of legitimacy? Legitimacy comes from the word legitimate. Legitimacy comes from the word legitimate. Now, what's the meaning of legitimate? Legitimate means in accordance with the laid down rules and procedure. Legitimate means in accordance with the laid down rules and procedure. This means that if something is in accordance with the laid down rules and procedure, then you can refer to that thing as legitimate. That's the meaning of legitimate. Now, what's the meaning of legitimacy? Legitimacy means a status confined with. Legitimacy refers to a status. Now, also, it has to do with the quality of being valid. Legitimacy has to do with the quality of being valid, one. It also has to do with the quality of being legitimate. Two, it also has to do with the quality of being lawful. Now, that's the meaning of legitimacy. Legitimacy has to do with the quality of being lawful, of being valid, of being legitimate. That is the meaning of, that's the literal meaning of legitimacy. But however, for this particular purpose, we'll be looking at legitimacy from the point of view of a child, for example. We are going to be looking at legitimacy from that angle, and we are going to be answering the question under this particular topic as to whether or not a child born within lawful wedlock is legitimate. We'll be answering that question, and we'll also be answering the question as to whether or not a child born outside lawful wedlock is legitimate. Those are the questions we are going to be answering under this particular topic. Is a child born within lawful wedlock legitimate, and is a child born outside lawful wedlock legitimate? So we are going to be answering this particular question today. Now, in answering this question, there are three views. There are three views in answering this question. One is the traditional view. The traditional view is also known as the English law. The traditional view is what the English law says. That's the first view. Another view is under Nigeria law, what Nigeria law says. That's another view. And the third view is under customary law, what customary law says. What does customary law see a child which was born outside lawful wedlock? Does customary law refer to that child as legitimate? So those are the three views: the traditional view, English law, which is the English law; traditional view, which is also known as the English law. That's the first one. The second one is Nigeria law. How does Nigeria law treat a child born outside lawful wedlock as? Does it see the child as legitimate? And the third view is under customary law. Now, those are the three views. Now, before proceeding and dissecting what these views are about, you must note the words birth and conception. Birth and conceive. Now, you'll be like, is there a difference between the word born and conceive? Yes, there is a difference between the words conceive and birth. This means that a child can be conceived today. A child can be conceived today, but given birth to 9 months time. So there's a difference between the word conceive and birth. But however, for this particular purpose, however, for this particular topic, we'll be using both words, conceive and birth. So you should not confuse yourself with both words. So you should know the meaning that a child, when a woman is impregnated today, you can use the word conceive. The child was conceived today, and then the woman gives birth to the child 9 months time. Now the woman have given birth to the child. That's birth. So a child can be conceived today, but given birth to 9 months time. So you should be able to differentiate the words conceive and birth. But for this particular topic, we'll be using both words. And when we are using these words, you should be able to distinguish between both words. You should not take birth for conception or take conception for birth. So you should be able to differentiate both words. Now, having said this, let's then look at the first view, which is the traditional view, and that's what the English law says. Let's first of all look at this view. Now, what does this view say? Now, the traditional view is that a child is legitimate if born under lawful wedlock. That's what the traditional view says. The traditional view, which is the English law, says that a child is legitimate if such child is born or conceived, if such child is born or conceived in lawful wedlock. Now, that's the traditional view. The traditional view says that if a child is given birth to within lawful wedlock. Now, what is lawful wedlock? Lawful wedlock means a valid marriage. Lawful lawful wedlock means a valid marriage, a lawful marriage, and not a void one. So the traditional view here is trying to say that when a child is given birth to within a valid marriage, that child is legitimate. And also, when a child is conceived within valid marriage, that child is legitimate. This means that if a woman is pregnant for a child within a valid marriage, if a woman conceives a child, is pregnant with a child within a valid marriage, then that child is legitimate. That's on the one hand for English law. And also the English law also says that if a woman gives birth to a child within lawful wedlock, that child is also legitimate. Even though the child was not conceived within lawful wedlock, even though the woman was not impregnated within lawful wedlock, but the child was given birth to within lawful wedlock, that child is legitimate. Likewise, the English law is also saying that if a woman was pregnant with a child within a valid marriage, but that child was not given birth to within that valid marriage, maybe they got divorced, the English law is also saying that child is legitimate. Whether the child was given birth to or was conceived within valid marriage, that child is legitimate as far as it is within a valid marriage. Now, that is it for the English law. And also, in contrast, the English law is also saying that a child given birth to outside lawful wedlock is illegitimate. That's the point of view of the English law. The English law says that a child born outside wedlock is referred to as illegitimate, although the child has identifiable parents. That's the point. That's another point of the English law. The English law is saying that when a child is not given birth to, or neither was the child conceived within a valid marriage, that child is illegitimate. Although you can say that this Mr. A is the father, Mrs. B is the mother of this child. Why is this child illegitimate? It is because the child was neither conceived nor was the child given birth to within a valid marriage. Now, that is the point of view of the English law. Then we will now come to Nigeria law. What does Nigeria law sees a child that was born outside lawful marriage or within lawful marriage as? Does Nigeria law sees both of them as legitimate? This then brings us to section 42 of the Constitution. Section 42 of the Constitution, which provides that section 42 subsection 2 of the Constitution, and it provides that no citizen of Nigeria shall be subject to any disability or deprivation merely by reason of the circumstances of his birth. That is what section 42 subsection 2 provides for. It says that no citizen of Nigeria shall be subject to any disability or deprivation merely by reason of the circumstances of his birth. Now, with this particular subsection, it simply says that the Nigerian law simply says that no matter the circumstance of the birth of the child, that child is legitimate. This is the view of the Nigerian law and not the English law, which only sees a child that was conceived or given birth to within lawful marriage as legitimate. But Nigerian law simply says that whether this child was born outside lawful marriage or was conceived outside lawful marriage, in fact, everybody is legitimate. There is no deprivation, there is no disability. That's the point of view of the Nigerian law. The Nigerian law simply sees every child, every citizen as legitimate. The Nigerian law does not see anybody as illegitimate. Everybody is legitimate under the Nigerian law, pursuant to section 42, subsection 2 of the Constitution. Now, this is the view of the Nigerian law. Then you now come to customary law. We now come to customary law. Now, under customary law, mere acknowledgement by the father that the child is his is enough to confer that child with legitimacy. Now, for customary law simply says that okay, a child born outside lawful wedlock, yes, the child is illegitimate. However, once the father of the child acknowledges the child born, the child was conceived, the child was given birth to outside lawful wedlock. However, once the father of the child acknowledges the child, once the father of the child recognizes the child as his, then that child is legitimate. That is what the customary law says. So this is unlike the Nigerian law or the English law. The customary law simply says that once the father of the child recognizes the child, acknowledges the child, once the father of the child acknowledges the child, then the child is automatically legitimate. That is what customary law says. Now, this thing brings us to the case of Taylor versus Taylor. Under customary law, this then brings us to the case of Taylor versus Taylor, where the decision of the court was that a father acknowledgement of the paternity is sufficient to confer legitimacy upon the children. That was the decision of the court in Taylor versus Taylor. So simply the court held that a father acknowledgement of a child is sufficient to confer the child with legitimacy. That was what the court held. So customary law view is simply saying that once a father acknowledges a child as his, then that child is legitimate. The English law point of view was say that once this child was conceived within lawful marriage or was given birth to within lawful marriage, then that child is legitimate. That's for the English law. The Nigerian law, the constitution, which is the ground, simply says that everybody is legitimate. That's for the Nigeria law. Now, customary law. Let's go back to customary law, which says that once a father acknowledges the child as legitimate, then that child is legitimate. That's for customary law. The question you now ask yourself at this particular juncture is that what is the mode of acknowledgement? What is the form of acknowledgement under customary law? Is there a format? Is there a way or a process? Is there a process of acknowledgement? Is there a form? Is there a method of acknowledgement? Is there a prescribed manner of acknowledgement under customary law? Is there a way that you say, a father must behave like this, must say these words before a child is legitimate, before you can acknowledge that form of acknowledgement as sufficient enough to confer that child with legitimacy? That's then the question. What is the form of acknowledgement? What is the manner of acknowledgement? Now, the answer is that there is no manner of acknowledgement. There is no form of acknowledgement at all. A father can, by his conduct or by his words, confer a child with legitimacy. So it is not that a father must hold a ceremony to confer a child with legitimacy under customary law. No, it can simply be by the father's conduct. Now, this then brings us to the case of Adeyemi versus Bamidele. Adeyemi versus Bamidele, where in this case, the paternity of the child was being contested. The court held that based on the fact that the disease cared for the child during his existence, for that he had acknowledged the child. The court held in this case of Adeyemi versus Bamidele that based on the fact that the father cared for the child, he had acknowledged the child. Now, in this particular case, the father did not hold a ceremony, so there is no prescribed form. The father did not hold a ceremony or call the elders together. I've conferred this child with legitimacy. No, but by the father's conduct, by the father's action, there was an implication that the father had acknowledged this child just by his conduct. So there is no prescribed manner of acknowledgement under customary law. There is no prescribed manner of acknowledgement. Also, let's then look at the case of Oladele and others versus Akimbola and others. Oladele and others versus Akimbola and others, where the court held that acknowledgement may be an imperfect act. In this particular case, the court held that acknowledgement may be an imperfect act, but must be perfected. You see it? That was the decision of the court. The court held that acknowledgement may be an imperfect act. The act may not be perfect. It can just be by conduct. It can just be by actions. It may be an imperfect act. It must not necessarily be a ceremony, but it must be perfected. It must be done. It must be done. So that was the decision of the court in Oladele versus Akimbola. So by this, you must know that there is no prescribed form of acknowledgement. It can be implied by the father's action, by the father's words, by the father's conduct. So that is it for customary law. Now, we are done with the views. We are done with the English law. We are done with the Nigerian law. And we are done with customary law. The next question you ask yourself is that customary law says that once a father acknowledges a child as his, no matter the child, that child has to be conferred with legitimacy. That's what customary law says. So it means that if the father does not acknowledge a child, then that child is illegitimate under customary law. That is what customary law says. And this customary law is applicable in Nigeria. And then, under Nigeria law, which is the constitution, which is the ground law, the constitution is the ground law, and the constitution says that everybody is legitimate. Everybody is legitimate, no matter the circumstances of the person's birth. Everybody is legitimate. But customary law is saying that not everybody is legitimate too, until the father acknowledges the child before the child is legitimate. That is what customary law is saying. So is there not a clash between customary law and the constitution? Yes, the answer is yes, although there is a clash. But however, due to the strongness, due to how strong our customs are in Nigeria, then that is in this particular instance, the provision of the constitution is not that applicable. Let me just give an example to clarify this. If, however, Mr. A, who is treated by the elders as illegitimate, the elders of a community, says that our daughter Mrs. B cannot marry Mr. A due to the fact that Mr. A is illegitimate. And then Mr. A goes to court to contest his legitimacy. And then Mr. A says that, pursuant to section 42, subsection 2 of the constitution, I am legitimate. The court will say, yes, Mr. A is legitimate. In Nigeria, nobody is illegitimate. That will be the decision of the court. But the elders will still say, no, you are not legitimate. We will not give you our daughter. The court will not force the elders to carry their daughter and give it to Mr. A. So you see where the two is coming in. Yes, there is a clash, but the court will not say, give Mrs. B to Mr. A. You must give him. The court will be like, the court will not take that kind of decision. The court will always say, Mr. A is legitimate. But the court can't go further. So this shows how strong our customs is in Nigeria. So yes, there is a clash, but due to the fact that our customs are very strong, that in this particular instance, it is somehow quiet. The provision of that section in the constitution is somehow quiet as it relates to this particular instance. So that is it for that. So under legitimacy, there are certain presumptions by the court. Under legitimacy, we have defined legitimacy, we have given the views on legitimacy, and we have looked at the clash between those two laws. But however, under legitimacy also, there are certain presumptions. There are presumptions under customary law, and there are also presumptions in England. There are presumptions under customary law, and there are also presumptions in England under the English law. Now, let's first and foremost define the word presumption. What is the meaning of presumption? Now, a presumption is an inference, assumption, or conclusion which is drawn until the contrary is proved. Now, a presumption is an assumption. It is an assumption that is drawn until the contrary is proved. So, first and foremost, the court will be assuming this to be so. The court will be assuming Mr. A to be legitimate. The court will be presuming Mr. A to be legitimate until the contrary is proved. So presumptions are rebutable. You can prove the contrary. You can cancel the presumption. So that's like the meaning of presumption. Presumption is an inference. Presumption is an assumption. Presumption is a conclusion until the contrary is proved. The court is only presuming it to be so until the contrary is proved. Now, let's first and foremost look at the presumption under customary law. Let's look at the presumption under customary law. Now, a child under customary law, a child may be presumed to be legitimate even if born after the dissolution of marriage of the parents and repayment of bride price. So under customary law, there is a presumption that a child is legitimate even if given birth to after the dissolution of marriage and repayment of bride price. So under customary law marriage, if the marriage is dissolved and the parties have refunded the bride price, the court will still presume that that child is legitimate. So this is it. This is a presumption under customary law. The court will still presume the child to be legitimate under customary law. That is it under customary law. So even if the child is given birth to after the dissolution of the marriage, after bride price have been refunded, there is a presumption. The court will still assume that this child is legitimate until the contrary is proved. Now this is it under customary law. Now let's then go to the presumptions in England. Presumptions under the English law. Presumptions in England. These are the presumptions by the court. Now the first presumption is that a child conceived before marriage is regarded as legitimate if born after the parties were divorced. So whenever a child, there is a presumption that a child conceived before marriage but given birth to after the parties were divorced, that child is legitimate. There is a presumption. Now let me illustrate this. If there is a presumption that if Mr. A and Mr. B were couples, now Mrs. B got pregnant before both of them got married. Before Mr. A and Mrs. B got married, Mrs. B got pregnant. Before Mr. A and Mrs. B got married, Mrs. B got pregnant before the marriage. Now they have gotten married, and now before Mrs. B gave birth to the child, Mr. A and Mrs. B divorced. Now after the divorce, Mrs. B gave birth to the child. Now what this place is trying to say is that there is a presumption that that child is legitimate until the contrary is proved. This is why it says that a presumption is that a child conceived before marriage but given birth to after the parties were divorced. There is a presumption that the child is legitimate. The court will assume that this child is legitimate until the contrary is proved. Now that's the first presumption. Let's then go to the second presumption. Another presumption is that a child born after artificial insemination is legitimate even though the donor is not the husband. This is the second presumption in England. After there is a presumption that a child given birth to after artificial insemination is legitimate even though the donor is not the husband. Now let's illustrate this. If what's this particular presumption say is that if a husband has a defect, and because of that his wife Mrs. B could not get pregnant, and then they consulted the hospital, and because of that they realized the defect, and they came to a conclusion that let's undertake artificial insemination. which means that a donor, which is like another man's sperm is taken and placed into the woman, is inseminated into the body of the woman, and then the woman gets pregnant. Now, the donor is not the husband. Even though the donor is not the husband, even though the donor is not the husband, the donor is not the husband. But for this particular aspect, there is a presumption that the child is legitimate. There's a presumption that that child that was given birth to through artificial insemination is legitimate. That presumption is always there until the contrary, until the parties are able to prove the contrary. There is a presumption. The court will first of all assume, okay, you have come to court for this particular case. You have come to court, but the court will first of all assume that that child is legitimate until the contrary is proved. Now, that's it for the second presumption. Let's then go to the third presumption. Now, the third presumption is that the law of domicile of the parents at the time of birth, at the time of the birth of the child, regards the child as legitimate. It will be deemed to be legitimate in England. Now, this is the third presumption. The third presumption is where the law of domicile of the parents at the time of birth of the child regard the child as legitimate. It will be deemed to be legitimate in England. This is the third presumption in England under English law. Now, what does this presumption say? Now, this presumption simply says that, let's give an instance. For polygamous marriage, for example, polygamous marriage is not recognized in England. Polygamous marriage is not recognized in England. Now, for that reason, children of a polygamous marriage are illegitimate if a party in England engage in a polygamous marriage. Those children from that polygamous marriage will be regarded as illegitimate. Now, what is our presumption is saying that if Mr. A and Mr. A engages in a polygamous marriage, if Mr. A engages in a polygamous marriage in a country that recognizes polygamous marriage, they are domiciled in that country. If Mr. A, who is domiciled in a country that recognizes polygamous marriage, engage in polygamous marriage and then gives birth to a child, gives birth to children, and this Mr. A comes to England that does not recognize polygamous marriage, he brings these children from the polygamous marriage to England. What this presumption says is that those children there is a presumption that those children are legitimate. Why? Due to the fact that they were given birth to, or due to the fact that the parties were domiciled in a country that recognizes polygamous marriage. Because of that, there is a presumption that those children are legitimate. That is it for the third presumption. Now, the fourth presumption is that where the child is a product of a void marriage, the child will be deemed to be legitimate if either of the parents at the time of its birth consider themselves to be in a valid relationship. Now, this is it for the fourth presumption in England. This presumption simply says that yes, children of a void marriage are illegitimate. The marriage is void. That is it. Children of a void marriage are illegitimate. But however, when both parties thought that this marriage we are into is not void, when both parties thought that this marriage that we engage in is not void, they thought it was legal, they thought it was lawful, and they engaged in the marriage, not knowing that it was void. The, the, it was unknown to them that the marriage was void. When both parties engage in a marriage that is void, however, it is unknown to them that the marriage is void. There is a presumption that the children of such marriage is legitimate. That is what this fourth presumption is talking about. That where the child is a product of a void marriage, the child is a product of a void marriage, so it ought to be illegitimate. The child is a product of a void marriage. The child will be deemed to be legitimate. The child will be presumed to be legitimate if either. They don't use the word both. They didn't use the word both. They use if either of the parents at the time of its birth, at the time of the birth of the child, consider themselves to be in a valid relationship. Now, let's illustrate this. If Mr. A and Mrs. B entered into a marriage, but it was unknown to them that they are brothers and sisters, and for that reason, the marriage is void. But however, it was unknown. They were not aware that, Mrs. B is my sister, let me not marry her. Mr. A was not aware, or neither was Mrs. B aware that they are siblings. So they engaged in this marriage and they gave birth to a child, which was C. Now, this presumption is trying to say that the court will presume that that child, that C that was given birth to by Mr. A and Mrs. B, the court will presume C to be legitimate. Why? It is because at that time of marriage, the parties, Mr. A and Mrs. B, thought that they were entering into a valid marriage. They never knew of the voidness. They never knew that this marriage we are entering into is void. So because of that, the court will presume that the child C is legitimate. That is what this presumption is trying to say. So these are the four presumptions in England. So for customary law, let's go over this presumption. For customary law, a child may be presumed to be legitimate even if born after the dissolution of marriage and repayment of bride price. That's simple. For customary law, that's a presumption under customary law, that a child will be presumed, the court will presume a child under customary law to be legitimate, even if the marriage has been dissolved and the bride price have been refunded. The court will presume the marriage to be valid. The court will assume the marriage to be valid until the contrary is proved. That's it for customary law. We now go to the presumptions in England. The first presumption is that a child conceived, where a child is conceived before marriage and then giving birth to after the dissolution of the marriage. This means that Mrs. B was pregnant before the marriage and then gave birth to the child after divorce. Mrs. B got pregnant before marriage. Then he married Mr. A. Now she did not give birth to the child during the marriage, but before she gave birth to the child, she got divorced. So the court will presume that child that was conceived before marriage and given birth to after marriage or after divorce, the court will presume that child to be legitimate. That's the first presumption. The second presumption is that a child born after artificial insemination is legitimate, even though the donor is not the husband, even though the person who donated the sperm is not the husband. The court will presume that child is legitimate. The court will presume that child to be legitimate, that was born of artificial insemination. The court will presume that child to be legitimate until the contrary is proved. Until the contrary is proved. That's it for the second presumption. Now, the third presumption. The third presumption is where the law of domicile of the parents at the time of birth of the child regards the child as legitimate, it will be deemed the child will be deemed to be legitimate. This means that if if at the if at the birth of the child, if Mr. A and Mrs. B are couples, Mr. A and Mrs. B are couples, and at the time they were giving birth to C, at the time Mr. A and Mr. B were giving birth to C, the law of domicile of the parents recognizes that marriage as valid. Then that child will be deemed to be legitimate in England. Just the way I use polygamous marriage as an example. Children born of polygamous marriage are not recognized as legitimate in England. But however, if at the time these children were given birth to, the domicile of the parents recognizes polygamous marriage. Let's use Nigeria as example. Mr. A and Mrs. B are Nigerians. They are in the northern part of Nigeria, and northern part of Nigeria recognizes polygamous marriage. But in England, they don't recognize polygamous marriage, and children born of polygamous marriage are deemed to be illegitimate in England. But in Nigeria, in northern part of Nigeria, which recognizes polygamous marriage, in northern part of Nigeria recognizes polygamous marriage, and Mr. A and Mrs. B gave birth, Mr. A and Mrs. B that are northern Nigerians gave birth to this child, and their domicile is Nigeria, and because of that, they regard the child is legitimate because of that. And when these children comes to England, these children will be presumed to be legitimate. Why? Because the law of domicile of the parents, the law of that's the Nigerian law, due to the fact Nigerian law recognizes these children as legitimate, these children will be presumed to be legitimate in England until the contrary is proved. That's what this third presumption is talking about. The fourth presumption is that a child who is a product of a void marriage will be deemed to be legitimate if both parties at the time of his birth consider themselves to be in a valid relationship. So when Mr. A and Mrs. B gives birth to a child, or in the process of giving birth to a child, they thought that they were in a valid marriage, the court will presume the child to be legitimate until the contrary is proved. So this is it for presumption. Now we'll now come to benefits of legitimacy. Benefits of legitimacy. What are the benefits of being legitimate? What is the benefit of a child that is legitimate? Now, the major benefit is that a legitimate child, legitimacy entitles one to succession and inheritance. Legitimacy entitles one. When one is legitimate, that person is entitled to succession, is entitled to inherit the properties of his father. But when that child is illegitimate, he is not entitled to inherit, especially under customary law, he is not entitled to inherit the properties of his father. So that is the benefit, the major benefit of legitimacy. Then we will not come to purpose of legitimacy. What is the purpose of legitimacy? What is the major purpose of legitimacy in the first place? Now, the major purpose of legitimacy is to give the legitimate child rights and privilege. The major purpose of legitimacy is to give that child that is legitimate all the rights and privileges, which is to inherit the properties and succession. That's the major purpose of legitimacy, is to give that child that is legitimate all the rights and the privilege for being legitimate. So due to the fact the child is legitimate, the child, how we the child, all the rights and privileges of being legitimate, the child is entitled to it. That's the purpose of legitimacy. Legitimacy entitles that child to full recognition as a member of a particular family and the entitlement accruing of such member. So this is the purpose of legitimacy. So that is it for legitimacy. Next, we'll be looking at legitimation. So thank you so much for watching. By name, I am Jafet Okaka. It was a talent.